Another very common kind of inductive argument is an argument from analogy. We'll see that these arguments from analogy are very closely related to inferences to the best explanation. But first, we got to ask, what's an analogy? An analogy is basically a comparison between two things. It points out similarities between those two things. And analogies are given all the time. For example, a poet might say, her eyes were like emeralds. Well, in what way were they like emeralds? They might have had the same color, they might have shimmered like emeralds, they might have been valuable like emeralds. And the analogy, her eyes were like emeralds, doesn't really tell you exactly which respect her eyes resembled emeralds. But that's part of the point. When you're writing poetry, you want to stimulate creative comparisons and analogies so that readers of the poem can think about it in their own way. And the same thing holds for other analogies in other areas. But because it's not very specific, some people think that analogies are just no good at all in arguments. Actually, though, we use analogies in arguments all the time. Here's an example from public policy. They built a transportation system in the city of Houston, Texas. It worked pretty well. And then the planners in the city of Phoenix, Arizona, were wondering what kind of public transportation system to build there. And they reasoned like this. They said, Phoenix is a lot like Houston in many ways. Large population, hot during the summer, many people, and large area. So they said, Phoenix resembles Houston in a lot of ways. This type of transportation system worked in Houston, so it'll probably work well in Phoenix also. Now, what about law? Lots of legal decisions are based on analogies too, because common law systems, at least, follow precedent. When judges decide a case one way at one point, then later on, other judges are supposed to make similar decisions. So you can say, for example, the Supreme Court declared that segregated public high schools are unconstitutional in the United States. Colleges are a lot like high schools, so segregated public colleges are also unconstitutional in the United States. And then med schools are a lot like colleges, so segregated public medical schools are also unconstitutional in the United States. And that's the way the legal system evolves, by drawing analogies among the different cases that come up within that jurisdiction. This form of argument in law might seem to be a real problem because you don't say exactly what the similarities are. But actually, it's very useful because it is predictable. If you know that segregated high schools have been declared unconstitutional, you pretty much know that judges are going to find colleges unconstitutional too if they're segregated. And it also gives flexibility so that judges can see when they're going too far, they say, well, that precedent's different, and they distinguish the precedents. So by resting legal reasoning on arguments from analogy, they gain both predictability and also flexibility in the legal system. So arguments from analogy can be pretty useful. Fine, but policies and laws are all about norms and values. What about science and hard facts? Well, scientists use analogies too. For example, scientists at one point didn't know what was at the center of the Earth, but they found a bunch of meteors and meteorites that had a high iron content, much higher than the content of iron in the crust of the Earth. So they reasoned the Earth must be like these other meteors and meteorites, so it must have a similar amount of iron in it because they were produced in the same way in the history of the universe. But that means there must be a similar amount of iron in the Earth. If it's not in the crust, where could it be? It must be down in the core. So they figured probably the core of the Earth has a lot of iron in it. Now, that's just one example, but scientists actually use analogies a lot. And if you don't believe me, Go read some psychological studies of scientific reasoning. We're going to focus on an example from art history. Just imagine that you're going through the attic and you find an old painting. It looks a lot like a painting by the famous Impressionist Cézanne. And if it is by Cézanne, it's worth an awful lot. But you got to figure out whether this painting is by Cézanne. How do you figure it out? Because Cézanne didn't sign it. He didn't sign a lot of his paintings. Well, what you do is you look at other Cézanne paintings and try to figure out whether they're similar. And if you're not an expert, you probably better check with an expert and have them do it. But they're going to do the same thing. They're going to compare this painting to a lot of other paintings that we know are by Cézanne. And then you can reason like this. This painting has a certain kind of brushwork and coloring and so on, subject matter, whatever. Other paintings by Cézanne have very similar brushwork and color patterns and topic and so on. Those other paintings are definitely by Cézanne, we know that. Therefore, this painting is probably by Cézanne as well. Now that's an argument from analogy. This argument from analogy shares a certain form with the other arguments from analogy that we discussed before. And we can pick out that form by substituting letters for the English words in the English argument. For example, we can substitute the letter A for the subject, that is, the topic of the argument, the painting that we don't know whether it's a Cézanne or not. And we can substitute the letters B, C, and D for the similar objects that are also Cézanne paintings. And we can substitute the letters P, Q, and R for the similarities between the paintings that we know are by Cézanne and the one that we're not sure of. And then we can substitute the letter X for that particular property of being by Cézanne. And when you substitute all those letters for the English words, then the argument simply says that object A has properties P, Q, and R, and objects B, C, and D also have those properties P, Q, and R. And B, C, and D also have the property X, so the subject, object A, probably also has the property X. Namely, this painting is by Cézanne. Probably. Of course, since this argument only tries to show that the conclusion is probably true, it's an inductive argument. It's not valid. It's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Namely, this painting might resemble all those other paintings in those respects, and yet it's not by Cézanne. Secondly, the argument's defeasible. You can get some additional information that makes it really look like a bad argument. For example, you could turn the painting over and on the back you find the signature of a different artist, like Seurat. And then you realize this isn't by Cézanne at all. But nonetheless, the argument can be strong. It can always be stronger because there can be more similarities and more important similarities, but it can be a strong argument and a good argument because it's inductive. So it doesn't even try or pretend to be valid. How can we tell when an argument for analogy really does give us a strong reason to believe the conclusion? What are the standards by which we measure how strong the argument is and how strong the reasons are? Well, one of them should be obvious. I mean, of course, the premises have to be true and justified, like in any argument. A standard that's relevant here is that when there are more important analogies, then it provides a stronger reason. Because some analogies are just totally unimportant. The painting is square. Other paintings by Cézanne are square. Therefore, this is by Cézanne. Well, that's ridiculous, right? Because lots of painters use square canvases. But something that's important, that's going to be specific to Cézanne and very, very idiosyncratic, is going to be more important for this type of argument. Secondly, when there are more analogies, because we don't know exactly which one is the one that's important. That's the point of an argument from analogy. You draw the analogy without knowing exactly which respect is the crucial one. So the more analogies that you have, the more likely you're going to hit on the ones that are crucial. So if it's not just brushwork, it's also the type of paint that was used. It's also the color scheme that was used. It's also the geometric shapes. It's also the subject matter. It's a particular mountain that's close by where Cezanne lived, and he painted a lot of that mountain. And on and on and on. The more analogies, the more likely that some of them are going to be the crucial ones, and therefore the stronger the argument is, and the stronger reason it gives you to believe that this particular painting is by Cezanne. But of course, there are always going to be some disanalogies as well, because Cezanne didn't paint the same thing over and over again exactly the way he did the first time. The fewer disanalogies, the stronger the argument. There'll always be some, or there wouldn't be much of an argument there. It would be exactly the same painting. But the fewer disanalogies, and the less important those disanalogies are, then the stronger the argument is going to be. Next, the objects that you're comparing, because they're similar in various respects. That is, the other paintings that we know are by Cezanne. If they're quite diverse, then that means that you have similarities among a diverse group. They all share these particular properties, and that means that Cezanne continued to use those features throughout all the different types of paintings that he did. And that means that it's going to be a stronger reason to believe that this painting is by Cezanne. Finally, the conclusion is weaker. You could say, therefore, this painting is definitely by Cezanne. It couldn't be anybody else. Well, that's kind of crazy, right? But if you say it's probably by Cezanne, it has some chance it's by Cezanne, maybe you want to check it further, then you're weakening the conclusion, and that can make the argument stronger. So in all of these different ways, we can assess how strong the argument from analogy is by looking at the respects in which the objects are analogous, the diversity among the objects that are analogous, the strength of the conclusion, and so on and so on. And that's how we assess an argument from analogy for strength. I want to close with one more example that raises interesting questions about the relationship between arguments from analogy and inferences to the best explanation. It concerns the pressing issue of whether Neanderthals were cannibals. Now, it's not a pressing issue for most people, but it is a very pressing issue for people who study Neanderthals. And so it's quite a breakthrough when they found some bones in a cave that they knew was inhabited by Neanderthals. In that cave, next to what looked like a fire pit, there were bones of deer with markings of a certain sort that looked like they had been cutting the meat off the bone. And they also found bones of humans in that cave where they had been cutting, where they had similar markings. And they argued, since the bones have similar markings, and these bones, the bones of the deer, were probably cut up for food, well, the human bones were probably also cut up for food. So they reached the conclusion that at least sometimes Neanderthals ate humans. What's interesting is that there are two ways to reconstruct this argument. First, you can reconstruct it as an argument from analogy. The bones of the humans were found in this location with these kinds of markings. And the bones of deer were also found in this location with these kinds of markings. The deer were cut up for food, therefore the humans were probably also cut up for food. Now that sounds like an argument from analogy when you think about it that way. But you can also reconstruct the argument as an inference to the best explanation. The bones of the humans had these markings on them and were in this location. How do you explain that? The best explanation of why they have these particular kinds of markings is that they were cut up for food. Therefore, the humans were probably cut up for food as well. Now notice that both reconstructions of the argument make the argument look okay. And so it's not clear which tells you the real structure of the argument. that the author was trying to give. And that means that arguments from analogy and inferences to the best explanation are actually very closely related. And sometimes you can take an argument and reconstruct it either way. It's not going to affect very much how strong the argument is, but it might affect how you see the argument working. And the big difference is that when you do an argument from analogy, you don't have to specify exactly which respect is important. So you can point out lots of analogies and hope that you hit the one that really matters. Whereas when you're doing an inference to the best explanation, then you have to pick out the specific property that gives you the explanation of the phenomenon that you observe. So it forces you to get a little bit more specific than with an argument from analogy. But otherwise, these two arguments are clearly very closely related, and they're basically two different ways to argue for similar conclusions. For example, in this case, with the argument from analogy, you don't know whether it's the location next to the fire or the types of markings, or maybe there's several different types of markings and they're all the same, but you don't know which ones are the ones that indicate how it was killed and which markings indicate how it was cut up to be eaten. And an argument from analogy can leave all that vague and just think that probably one of those similarities justifies the conclusion that the humans were cut up to be eaten. But if you're going to give an inference to the best explanation, then you're saying that these markings, for example, diagonal markings on leg bones, might suggest that they cut that up in a certain way because that's how they prepared the deer meat, and they were used to preparing deer meat that way. So they used similar cutting techniques when they were preparing human meat. And you've got an explanatory story that's much more specific than a mere analogy, but it also commits you to a lot, so it might be questionable in various ways. So when you look at an argument like this, you've got to decide which way to reconstruct the argument, as an argument from analogy or as an inference to the best explanation. And the general rule is one that we saw long ago in the early weeks of this course. If you really want to understand an argument, you want to understand your opponent's, or you want to have a better argument for yourself, then you try to make the argument look as good as possible. So when you face a particular example like the Neanderthal example, you have to decide, is this argument going to be better if I reconstruct it as an argument from analogy, or is it going to be better if I reconstruct it as an inference to the best explanation? And the best reconstruction is going to be the one that makes the argument look best.